My name is Annette Frost. I'm the director of the Favorite Poem Project here at Boston University, and we are very excited to be joined by two extraordinary poets tonight, Peter Balakian and Susan Barba. Before we get started, I just want to mention that immediately following the reading, there will be a Q&A. So if you have any questions for Peter and Susan, you can send them via the chat box, via the Q&A box throughout the evening. And then at the end of the reading, we'll get to as many questions as we have time for. That said, I will hand this screen over to the founder of the Favorite Poem Project and the director of BU's creative writing program, who will introduce the series. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pinsky.
Thank you, Annette. It is my pleasure twice a year when we have these readings to explain the occasion. When Nancy Livingston and Fred Levin set up this reading series for BU, Nancy gave it its name. Nancy had a distinguished, very effective profession supporting the arts, but her profession was advertising. She was a very no bullshit person. She didn't call it public relations. She called it advertising very proudly. And the subtitle, In the Spirit of Room 222, was Nancy Livingston's idea. We lost Nancy. I still miss her very much. She knew the lore that in the room where we usually have these readings and where Carl Kirchway, Nicole Seeley, and I still teach poetry classes in actual rather than virtual times, and where Ha-Jin and Leslie Epstein and Sigrid Nunez teach fiction. Robert Lowell taught a class in which the students included Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and George Starbuck. And it's my traditional role to say the spirit of that group is they were artists together. I now twice a year explain that the spirit of Room 22, as Nancy and I and Fred thought about this, the spirit was of art, happy to be a guest and a participant in the university world, but the hierarchies and categories of teacher and student or full professor or assistant or associate or demi or semi-professor, those didn't apply. I need to add something different this time. Usually we do not have the BU alum who gives a short reading and introduces our guest. The roles played tonight by Susan Barba and Peter Balakian. It's unusual that these are two people in whose work their family history and Armenian history means something that they share. It's important for me to say that one of the interesting things and important things about the occasion and these two wonderful poets is that they're very different. The idea, maybe there's some sense that in a fractious time period, the wisdom that comes from Holocausts and genocides is particularly welcome, but I'm happy to pay tribute to these poets who are so different. It's true that in Susan Barba's wonderful first book, Fair Sun, this wonderful evocation. I've written about the book, she thinks in voices and she thinks in images. And in her class here, class that included our previous Lowell readers, Natasha Hakimi, and just the previous one with Natasha Trethewey introducing Natasha, Meg Fernandez. Susan was a tremendously helpful teacherly as well as editorial presence there. And as I wrote about that book, one of the voices is an ancestral, indeed male voice. Peter Balakian's two most recent books, the Pulitzer Prize winning Ziggurat, the Ozone Journal, rather, the muse is history. And in Fair Sun, Susan's muse also is history. But her second book, the muse is something more like the earth itself. And the imagination, for example, to write a poem that is basically spoken by the earth itself is a measure of the audacity and her imagination. So important for me to say that these poets are wonderful and absolutely distinctive, although they do share certain kinds of history. One could almost add, who doesn't? It is a pleasure now to introduce Susan Barba, who will give a reading and then introduce Peter Balakian. I give you Susan Barba.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a beautiful introduction. And thank you, Catherine, for being behind the scenes and organizing, and Annette for being so instrumental in making this happen. I'm really so glad to be here, even virtually, with all of you, and especially reading with Peter. This means a great deal. So I'll start out, I'll read a couple of poems from Fair Sun, my first book Robert mentioned. And then I think I was going to read a poem, a particular poem from Geode, but maybe I'll read the poem that Robert mentioned that speaks from the voice of the earth. So the first poem is titled In the Shadows, and it's the first poem in Fair Sun. Places a child never wants to go, under the mulberries whose black juice stains the soles, beneath the windbreak of cedars shutting their bark in shreds, the same brown as the dead cicadas. Squat on the hill, the incinerator of detritus, compacted of leaves, bracken, last summer's weeds, and higher the gated garden, the rusted latch requiring full weight shouldered against the door before the bolt would budge and shudder and the door bump open, catching on tufts of grass. In the solar system of the child, the garden would be the sun, in her nightly prayer with mother, father, safe from harm. How close they are to one another, the garden, the fire pit, the dark groves, a panting dash by day, hair's breadth by night, the golden orbs of apricots, the darkness of the dirt that feeds them. I'll read another poem that has an Armenian presence in it. This poem is titled Yerevan, New York, Yerevan, New York. Yerevan is the capital city of Armenia. And this has to do with shuttling back and forth between two countries, two cultures, two forms of consciousness. What to do with the 5 flies grazing this head of cheese, or the texture of this carpet's blue, which is the weight of water on a cloudy day at Savon Lake, and the pattern of fish, of dragons, weaving the drowned and mythic together. What will save them? If not language, then a currency, something hard that answers the cry at the marketplace. Why, if you say how beautiful, don't you buy it? Own it, and your tongue fumbles for coins in the dark change purse of your mouth. In a sketch by Dali, it's a closer look brings you eye to eye with a skull, two larger grapes toward the cluster stem, forming sockets of the absent eyes. In the bone-clean room of the museum, two grapes grow glaucous with a powdery bloom of ripeness, rounding with the pleasure of a riddle. Somewhere green, a man tucks with a shepherd's crook a tendril into the woven roof of grapevines outside his door. Neighboring, I watch, but he stands in the dappled suns of his living roof, holding his crozier, wearing a cape of light. A man is pouring water from a pail. A man is speaking as though pouring water from a pail. He is too far for me to understand him, his meaning flashing and reflecting, a shadow tossed by the sun back at me, but I recognize the sound of the rushing, the mass of it hitting the ground, the bright white sound of it. So I'll move on to Geode, which came out in April of last year, a strange time for a book to come out. But it was a book that is about the earth, as Robert mentioned, and it's about being outside and allowing our perceptions to become clearer and benefiting from what the earth might have to offer us when we give it our attention. So this is Letter from Gaia. Gaia is the mythical name, the Greek mythical name for the earth. I am writing this in minuscule from the foot of the old hills while marauders uproot the last impediments to progress. Do they think I am resigned, incapable of anger, that I orbit the sun submissively out of some dark planetary passivity? That my amorality, as they call it, is intrinsic, just my nature? Perhaps. How long I've kept from even lisping it, but simmered, wept, and shuddered. How can I turn my back on my children? They want nothing less than my absolute subjugation. How long it took me to prepare this place for them. They know something of my art, even if they cannot imagine me staring down infinitude, racing to keep the darkness from their lives. What I have made is what I am: rain, wind, dirt, light, grasses, sedges, clouds, rivers, oceans, glaciers, deserts, waves of sand, waves of water, seabirds, songbirds, birds of prey, volcanoes, fire, flame, sparks, eddies, avalanches, beetles, bees, mice, moths, forests, tundra, mountains, mushrooms, wildflowers. My materials were time and liquid water. They have bagged the leaves, set forests, rivers on fire, broken ground. They have walked hand in hand, slept in each other's arms. They have set down flags to snap in the wind. They have laid grids over the land. They have lit fireworks, dropped bombs and mothers of bombs, painted in caves, laid paving stones, peered through viewfinders, through scopes. They have caught me in the crosshairs. They have seen their own skin, their very lashes reflected back at them, the giants. Their fingerprints are tiny spiral jetties. Their footsteps pass and pass. Their bodies have no armor. The torsos of their young are blameless. I want to remember how it was. Do you know the trilobites? They were the first here who could see. They once had eyes. They are embalmed in stone. And once upon a time, my children were wise and wild and listened. They have turned the rain to acid. They have named Superfund sites. They have forced their young to drink lead, breathe ash. They have laced the land they grow their rice in with arsenic. They have contaminated the water they catch their fish in with mercury. They have drawn precious metals out of the ground with cyanide. They have sacrificed their sons to the dirt for diamonds, the sea for pearls. They have manufactured poisons, nerve gas, atom bombs, agents of biological warfare. During exercises in which they practice killing each other, their brains have been shaken by the concussive waves of their weapons. They have lost their bearings and they multiply and multiply. Once they cleaved to me, now they disregard me. They are addicted to ephemera which profit them nothing. How little they have, how lean their margin. I think I will stop there. And it's my great, great pleasure to introduce Peter. For nearly 50 years, Peter Balakian has been writing poems that tell the time of history. But these are not static, antique timepieces. They are electrifying, contrapuntal, visionary, and defiant. They begin this morning or last night, or as we begin in media res, in the middle of things. But they are not bound by the laws of physics like we are. They move as our minds do, bound to particular detail, but at liberty in time. Like Theodore Roethke, of whom he's written so movingly, Peter dreams of journeys too, and undertakes them. Not just journeys, but pilgrimages, quests, and odysseys, real and imagined, hallucinations, fever dreams. There is a feeling reading his poems of being in the archives, but these are the archives of a seer, arranged according to emotional and psychic correspondences. Time in Peter's poems cracks and breaks open like a thawing river, ice shelves shifting, changing substance, past, present, and future bumping up against each other. All the tenses we inhabit simultaneously, Peter makes them sing. He captures all the modes, the multiplicities of living through keen juxtaposition. He lets nothing go to waste. He incorporates the found, the stumbled upon, the Stolpersteins into his archive and saves them from oblivion. It's a real honor to introduce Peter to you tonight, not only because he is one of our greatest living poets, winning the Pulitzer Prize for his oracular and far-reaching collection, Ozone Journal, in 2016, but also because of what his work has meant to me personally. There's much discussion now of the importance of being able to recognize ourselves in literature, but that wasn't always the case. Peter's extraordinary PEN Award-winning memoir, Black Dog of Fate, was one of the first books I identified with as an Armenian American. It was a formative book for many of us and a revelation for others. Peter has been a pioneer in the translation of Armenian literature, co-translating Bloody News from My Friend by Siamanto, a brilliant poet and activist who was executed by the Turkish government in 1915. Peter went on to co-translate his great uncle Grigoris Balakian's eyewitness account of the genocide, Armenian Golgotha, as well as a travel memoir most recently, The Ruins of Ani. Peter has written one of the most compelling histories of the genocide, The Burning Tigris, and in 2016, he received the Republic of Armenia's Presidential Award for his contribution to the process of recognition of the genocide. In addition to being an award-winning poet, prose writer, translator, and scholar, Peter is also a revered teacher. He is the Donald M. and Constance H. Rebar Professor in Humanities and Professor of English at Colgate University, where he has taught since 1980. I find it illuminating that Peter received his doctorate from Brown University in American Civilization. One of his primary concerns has always been civilization and its endurance in the face of destruction. The word civilization was first used in 1760 to mean specifically the stage of cultural development at which writing and the keeping of written records is attained. The written record is of central importance in Peter's writing, as is the etymological root of civilization, civil, meaning of or relating to citizens. What makes a citizen, a culture, a civilization are the questions Peter keeps asking. His poems sharpen our perceptions and admit us into forms of music and meaning that deepen our understanding of what it is to be part of a record-keeping people. Please join me in welcoming Peter Balakian.
Susan, thank you for your generous words and thoughts. The only thing I quibble about is 50 years. I have to think about that. It's a pleasure to be reading with Susan again. It's our second duet, and I just want to urge all of you to go out and buy her marvelous new book, Geode. I want to thank you, Annette Frost, for all you've done to make tonight work so well. And great thanks to Robert Pinsky. I'm grateful to Robert for many things, mostly for his work and what it has meant to American poetry for so many years, and what he's done for literature in this country and beyond. He sets a high bar for us all. I'm honored to be under the sign of Robert Lowell, and I am eager to get into room 222, and I'm happy to feel the spirit of room 222 tonight through Zoom. I'm coming to you from my living room on 10 Hamilton Street in Hamilton, New York, not far from the Colgate campus. Like many poets, I'm sure, certainly of my coming of age time, Robert Lowell meant a good bit to me. I learned a lot from him. He has been a towering artist in American culture and still is. And I wrote a tribute to Robert Lowell that I published a version of in my first book, and I revisited it and wrote another version of it in a later book. And I thought, well, I've never read this poem, and if I don't read it tonight, I surely will never read it. So I want to read it tonight to celebrate Lowell. And as Robert noted, the extraordinary writers who were with him together in that workshop room in another period. Lowell was an obsessive, omnivorous writer. Among his obsessions was early American literature. And this poem called Robert Lowell near Stockbridge kind of feeds off Lowell's passions for early American writers, Edward Taylor, Aunt Bradstreet, Hawthorne and Melville a bit later, the great Jonathan Edwards. Robert Lowell near Stockbridge. The traffic thinned past Chicopee, farmland hardened and recalled, Edwards and his relic oak, where a spider set its web in your heart before you left the Alps. In the red light of maples, where Edward Taylor once sang at a wasp pinned in a net, you left your insects for the test in rotten, hollow logs. And the knot God made in paradise tightened on the hills. Your eye flushed out a September morning when trees were stitched with webs too fine to see, and spiders swam the air and turned to glisten. Invisible filaments your heart gave way before. A Berkshire hawk dove on them and left the maples in their beauty, untenable as gristle. Robert noted my engagement with the Armenian genocide past and Susan's engagement similarly in our different registers. My grandmother has been a kind of spirit in my life, although she died when I was 13. Her story and her wisdom and her depth have informed a good bit of pieces of my writing over the years. She was the only survivor of her large, prosperous family from southeastern Anatolia, once historic Armenia, today southeastern Turkey, in a city called Diyarbakir. She made it after a 5-year period of hideout and refugee in Aleppo with her 2 infant daughters, toddler daughters by the end. And they got to Ellis Island in 1920. That monument, that nexus for refugees and immigrants. It's always been part of an American dream, and only in the recent years has it been tarnished by Donald Trump's aspersions and cruelties, but I don't think it's tarnished for forever. It's already returning, the spirit of immigration. This poem is called Ellis Island. The tide's a Bach cantata. The beach is the swollen neck of Isaac. The tide's a lamentation of white opals. The beach is free. The Coke machine rusted out. Here's everything you'll never need. Hemp cords, curry combs, jade and musk, a porcelain cup blown into the desert, stockings that walked to Syria in 1915. On the rocks, some ewes and rams graze in the outer dark. The manes of the shoreline undo your hair. A sapphire ring is fingerless. The weed and algae are floating like a bed, and the bloodless gulls, whose breaths would stink of all of us if we could kiss them on the beaks, are gnawing on the dead. A number of years back, my family and I decided to get out of the Northeast for the Christmas craziness and the terrible weather of the Northeast. And we went to New Mexico and spent some time roaming around Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Taos. On Christmas Day, we found ourselves on the pueblo of the Santo Domingo and watched for hours the extraordinary Christmas dance that this tribe performs on that day. This is called Pueblo Christmas Dance. 1. I took a wrong turn into a sun mask, on mud, into straw glue and smashed yucca. If you saw them rub feathers on their arms, if the claws of bear wrapped them, if the porcupine and badger were sewn to the skin, if gusts of God flew into lightning riven wood. All morning I drove out of one life into another, through no water and empty self. I saw the coordinates of a masthead of a wrecked car. My car took the curve of a curve just past the exit to Los Alamos, where Oppenheimer said the infinite imploded finite space. Though he couldn't have imagined the atom pressed into the cave inside the mesa that opened into the buffalo who could turn into a bear, who could be the beast. 2. She was carried between the horns of the animal. The grass brushed the sky. She drank from the horn. The hill swallowed the dirt, which became a horn of water. The horn of water was passed among many. Many drank while a chief blew yellow powder through an eagle-winged bone. Space dissolved into a gourd rattle that made me feel the heart shake. In the dry cold, in the catapult past Jesus, where the bones and kernels shook in the dry skin, there was relief. Euclidean infinity dissolved. I could hear the end of history in the teeth rattling inside a gourd. For a second, blue spears of lightning shot over 3 women sleeping under the canopy of a mud house. The sun poured on all of us. Here and now. The day comes in strips of yellow glass over trees. When I tell you the day is a poem, I'm only talking to you, and only the sky is listening. The sky is listening. The sky is as hopeful as I am, walking into the pomegranate seeds of the wind that whips up the seawall. If you want the poem to take on everything, walk into a hackberry tree, then walk out beyond the seawall. I'm not far from a room where Van Gogh was a patient, his head on a pillow, hearing the Mistral careen off the seawall, hearing the Phobos leaves pelt the sarcophagi. Here and now, the air of the tepidarium kissed my jaw, and pigeons ghosting in the blue loved me for a second before the wind broke branches and guttered into the trees. What questions can I ask you? How will the sky answer the wind? The dawn isn't heartbreaking. The world isn't full of love. I'm a poet for whom visual arts have mattered a good bit. I've written about painters. I find myself diving into collages and sculpture and installations. So in that ekphrastic mode, I've had a lot of delight and a lot of probing. Among painters who've been interesting to me, especially in recent years, Andy Warhol is one, and his lithographs, especially those of the 60s and 70s, did something so inventive in the way they appropriated history and created an aesthetic form out of a historical moment, sometimes a contemporary event. Years later, looking back at those lithos, I find my own mode of navigating time and self alive. This is called Warhol Electric Chair 63. And the particular piece, this green and red litho, Warhol did to commemorate what was supposed to be the last capital punishment in the state of New York at Sing Sing. 63, you remember the year the Beatles planned their invasion of the US. Warhol electric chair, 63. The red spreads like Christmas wrapping, the green a field and a Caucasian rug. It's almost beautiful without the metal plates for the head, although the plug on the floor is visible. Before decorator colors and Hockney, Calvin Klein in the summery Hamptons, before there were switches to break the flow. My mother used to say, never touch a radio when you're in the bathtub. Never fly a kite near transmission lines. But still, it's furniture. Still, it's a typical American way to go. It's Sing Sing, the silhouette of Ethel Rosenberg. It's in the rheostatic air, the absent man heard, she loves you. The British invasion and the flat line arrived at once. Outside, Negroes were eaten by dogs. Johnson was sworn in. Cuba turned red in the Green Sea. In our really fine conversation with the workshop students before the reading, we were talking a little bit about approaching events that are happening right in front of you and around you. And I certainly noted that for me, it's a challenge. I have a hard time absorbing a large event into a lyric poem in a very close kind of time frame. And I was thinking about the phone call I got after 9/11, right after 9/11, a poet called me who was editing an anthology. He had already contracted this anthology and called me and said, would you commit to writing a poem for the anthology? I want to submit a table of contents right away. And I said, yes, I would, knowing that I knew I wouldn't be able to write a poem by the end of the year. But somehow, having gotten that phone call and even making the gesture, it prompted me to get on a train a few days after 9/11 in central New York at the Utica train station, not far from where I live, and go down to 9/11 and see Ground Zero. And it was a sobering moment. It would be another 5 years before I could write poems that dealt with that moment. And so I'm going to read that poem that got me writing a group of poems around 9/11. I didn't try to write about the explosion and terrorism, but around it a bit. And this is called Going to Zero. It's about getting on that train and going down to the site. 1. A canvas with less turpentine, more hard edges, less bleeding. That was good for beauty. Frankenthaler in Art News, in the dining car, crammed with parkas and laptops, microwaved cellophane, plastic plates and canvas bags. And the valley under fog as the cows disappeared. And when the green came back into view, I could see the SUVs floating on the thruway, the cows oblivious to the revved engines of trucks. The river glistened all the way to Albany, and I could see flags on Baptist churches and resurrection trailers. God Bless America on pickups. United We Stand laminated to billboards as the fog settled, then lifted. And when I woke, a flag the size of a football field hung from the gray tower of the GW, where the tractor trailers jammed beneath its hem as something sifted down on the silver-plated Hudson, and then the lights went out. 2. The faces on 7th Avenue blurred in the chaos of vendors and liberty scarves, freedom ties, glowing plastic torches, dollars and polyester. And inside Macy's, I was hit by cool air as Stars and Stripes forever floated down from women's fashions into the quiet aisles of Aramis and silk scarves. I wanted to buy the Frankenthaler, a modest early print, minimal, monochromatic, surface and perspective in dialogue on 24th off 10th. The gallery still smelled like wood and plaster, but I didn't stop. And when the train reached the stock exchange, the Yom Kippur streets were quiet, and the bronze statue of Washington was camouflaged by National Guard. I was walking my old mail route now, like a drunk knocking into people, almost hit by a cab until the roped off streets cut me at the arm. At Broadway and Liberty, the fences wound around, the bursts of dust rising over the cranes and bulldozers, over the punched out windows. I stared through a piece of rusted grid that stood like a gate to the Crystal River. I was sweating in my sweatshirt now, the hood filling with soot, as I watched with others drinking Cokes and eating their pizza of disbelief. 0 began with the Sumerians who made circles with hollow reeds and wet clay and baked them for posterity. At Broadway and Liberty, at 20 floors charred and standing, at Miasma, people weeping, Anna's nail salon, Daikichi sushi, the vacant shops stripped clean in the graffiti of dust-coated windows. Something blasted from a boombox in a music store. Something in the ineffable chips of light disappeared over the river. In my new book, due out maybe about a year, title is No Sign. One no sign. I have a group of poems which are odes, object meditation, odes of sorts. Most of them are on fruits and vegetables. And this is called Eggplant. And you'll pick up the evocation of Armenian genocide, traumatic memory. My grandmother's death march keeps percolating in my life in different ways, that she survived that death march. 1.5 million Armenians didn't. Eggplant. I loved the white moon circles and the purple halos on a plate as the salt sweat them. The oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert. When a moon stayed all day, when morning was a purple elegy for the last friend seen. when the fog of the riverbank rose like a holy ghost. My mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. Some parsley appeared from the garden, and summer evenings came with no memory, but the table with white dishes. Shining aubergine, black-skinned beauty, bitter apple. We used our hands. And this ode from that, this section is actually on, it's not a fruit or a vegetable, but you'll see its relation. This is called matzah. My oldest friend, Alan Schwartz, was blown out of the sky in a helicopter over the Sinai Peninsula during the 73 Israeli-Egypt war. He was about 24 and left behind a 6-month-old matzah. Sometimes when I look up at the moon, I think of Alan Schwartz, in whose kitchen I sat on Passover. We were the only Christians on the block, eating corrugated sheets of bread, though it didn't feel like bread. In the evening, the moon's white light followed me home. I didn't understand what God commanded the Jews to do. At the Formica counter before the Seder, we crunched on the mother of all wafers. Out of Egypt, there was moonlight over the stillness, crisp and sweet to the tongue. What was the bread of affliction? Years later, when Alan was shot out of the sky over the Sinai, I asked the moon, what was the no yeast of freedom? I walked for days to get to the Red Sea because Exodus led to Deuteronomy. Even now, when I'm shivering at the water's edge, the sky no more blue than ash over trees. The difference between prophecy and law is the difference between the moon and the sea. The end of the body is one half of death, the absence of moonlight, the other. Trying to find my poem. The older I get, the more I ask the question, what is home? And when your history is defined by diaspora and exile, when your grandparents were born in another world and they were butchered out of it, in this case by the Turkish government in 1915 during the Armenian genocide, you find that your family is scattered to the globe. I have had family on every continent, at different times. And so the question of what home is a beguiling one, and one that provokes a kind of mapping of oneself in relation to one's ancestors and to history in the end, which shapes us in so many ways. This is called home. Driving Route 20 to Syracuse, past pastures of cows and falling silos, you feel the desert stillness near the refineries at the Syrian border. walking in fog on Maycock's Bay, the long lines of squawking birds on shore. You're walking along Flinders Street Station, the flaring stone and walls of windows where your uncle landed after he fled a Turkish prison. You walked all day along the Yarra, crossing the sculptural bridges with their twisting steel, the hollow sound of the didgeridoo like the flutes of Anatolia. One road is paved with coins, another with razor blades and ripped condoms. Walking the boardwalk in January past Atlantic City Hall, the rusted deco ticket sign, the waves black into white. You smelled the grilled chavapi in the bashashia of Sarajevo. And that street took you to the Jewish cemetery where the weeds grew over the slabs and a mausoleum stood intact. There was a trail of carnelian you followed in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, and picking up those stones now, you're walking in the salt marsh on the potato fields, the day undercut by the flatness of the sky, the wide view of the Atlantic, the cold spray. Your uncle stashed silk and linen, lace and silver in a suitcase on a ship that docked not far from here. The ship moved in and out of port for years, and your uncle kept coming and going from Melbourne to Calcutta to London and back, never returning to the Armenian village near the Black Sea. The topaz ring you passed on in a silver shop in Aleppo appeared on Lexington off 65th. The shop owner, a young guy from Ivory Coast, shrugged when you told him you'd seen it before. The shuffle dust of that street fills your throat, and you remember how a slew of coins poured out of your pocket like a slinky near the ruined castle, now a disco in Thessaloniki, where a young girl was stabbed under the strobe lights, lights that lit the sky, that was the iridescent eye of a peacock in Larnaca. At noon, when you walked into the church where Lazarus had come home to die, and you forgot Lazarus died, because the story was in one of your uncle's books that were wrapped in newspaper in a suitcase and stashed under the seat of an old Ford. And when you got to the border, he left the car and walked the rest of the way. And when you pass the apartment on 116th and Broadway, where your father grew up, though it's a dorm now, that suitcase is buried in a closet under clothes. And when you walk past the security guard at the big glass entrance door, you're walking through wet grass, clouds clumped on a hillside, a subway station sliding into water. And I'll close with two short poems. Having talked about how difficult it is to absorb catastrophic moments, I will say that the pandemic moment has provoked some interesting meditations. And I see that it's provoked interesting meditations from a lot of poets, because I've been reading poems in various magazines. And I know it's provoking fiction and nonfiction. There's something bizarre and untabulatable about the amorphousness and the severity of the pandemic. And I can't claim to comprehend it. But I have written a few poems, and I will read one of them, which will also be in the new book. It's called Shadow Grid. April 2020, another journey down to the city from upstate. When I came to, crocuses were pushing up purple in my garden. Return of the cooing dove. And when I got out at Penn Station, there were no faces along the tracks. Wind blew through 32nd Street with a faint whiff of onions and hairspray. Cabs drifted between lanes like bumper cars at Asbury. Crosswinds, crosstown, the Ouroboros shape of Columbus Circle. Etruscan bullseye, Minoan nude, the cylinder seals of Ur, stately people on folding stools at the Met in the dark, the peace, the peace, the peace. A bird, the stripes of a flag, a floating bridge. The nation's pleasure myth unspooling through stadiums and supermarkets. I see a wavering horizon across borders from the shanked Palisades below Fort Lee. Air flows through my open window like any day, innocent, coming over the Hudson. This seems like the right note to end on. How much I love you. How much I love you when your shadow walks through the wall, when my heart is a false beat, when throbbing moves around the room the way floaters spin across the eye, when the pale green of wet grass, when the confusion of new leaves, when the brushstrokes are blue, when the buds of azaleas spread across lawns, when daylight is water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Susan. What a complete gift to get to hear both of those readings tonight. That was just fantastic. Gotta let that sink in for a minute. I see that there is at least one question into the Q&A. If anybody has questions for Peter and Susan, at the bottom of your screen over to the right, you'll see a little Q&A box that's separate from the chat that you can type any questions into. And we will answer as many as we can. To start us off, Peter, we have one question for you, which is, what drew you to the fruits and vegetables that are in your new book?
They all resonated with vibes. They were all fruits and vegetables that I've spent my life savoring, enjoying, looking at, cooking with, because I love to cook. And so they were already speaking to me, and they'd been speaking to me for a while. It just seemed like the time had come to begin to write the ode or the meditation.
Thank you. And Susan, and Catherine, if we can get Susan up on the screen here too. I'm not sure if she's perfect. Thank you. A question for you from Brianna, Susan. How are you incorporating your experiences, objects, sounds, dreams, etc., into your poetry? Or more broadly, do you write poems or do poems come to you?
Some big questions. I think I'll take the second part first. We were talking about this in the workshop. Peter and I, with the graduate students, and we discussed how you have the intuitive side, the chef was the metaphor we were using, and then the editorial side, the architect, and how both of these personas need to be at play when you're writing a poem. You need to give a long leash to the chef to create, and then also bring the architect in to revise. And I think that's the best description of it. So poems, do come to you, ideas come to you. You try to really make sure you listen and heed them when they come. It's terrible when you're walking and an idea comes and you don't have a pen and paper to write it down, or your phone, because then they're gone, and then the poem is gone with it. So I don't think I answered the first part, but that's so broad. Maybe
it was
enough.
how you incorporate your experiences, objects, sounds, and dreams into your poetry.
It's really a mystery. It's a mysterious process. It's, I think, through reading and studying how others have done it before me, and learning from their examples.
Thank you. Peter, from Sean, one of the students that we were just meeting with earlier today, he says, you are an outspoken advocate of human rights and international issues surrounding genocide, but you talk about not letting the issues close to your heart, quote, sit on your heart. And you say you don't want to use the pen as the poem as a megaphone. The question is, how do you keep these parts of your life separately? For someone who's passionate and committed to seeing the truth be known about historical events such as Armenian genocide, why and how do you keep your poetry from becoming a megaphone?
Well, if by megaphone, I mean, it's a rich question, and we could have a kind of seminar just about that issue. I think that, I mean, one reflection here in the history, in literary history, one witnesses a broad range of writers with many different kinds of sensibilities who performed what they need to do with their art in their studio, in the studio of their head, with their materials and their aesthetic aspirations and their aesthetic goals and ideals, and then left their studio and went into another zone in the public space and worked for various civic, public, and political issues that compelled them. Adrian Rich, William, Yeats, James Baldwin, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir. And the list is long, and to compile a list of writers, Virginia Woolf is another extraordinary presence in this domain. To compile that list is an interesting way of studying the lives of literary artists, for example, and you can make this list in the other arts, in the visual arts and in music and so on. And you see that writers simply live multifarious lives. But I think the important thing is to always remember Yeats's final lines in the last poem he wrote. Irish poets, know your trade, make whatever is well made. And so when you're in the studio with your materials, your adherence is to the transformation of those materials into the art you aspire for. And when you leave the studio, right now, I want to just note I'm a committee member, a founding member of an organization called, now it's called Writers for Democratic Action, a marvelous group of American writers who write in many different spectrums of aesthetic orientation, but who are really committed to democracy and social change. And we've come together, and there are 2,100 members of this organization now. And so it's very heartening to see the enormous community of writers who have various commitments to the civic space. And as writers, we should use the spaces we own in our own lives. In other words, if we have readers, if we give lectures, if we exist in a public space, and if we make words as writers do, we can make some things happen out there in the civic space by virtue of our own professional kind of space, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And Susan, I don't know if you want to also jump in on that. If not, I have another one here for us.
I think I'll just add that also, different types of writing contribute in various ways to causes. And I think, Peter, your work, as a historian and scholar on the Armenian genocide, for example, is a way of bringing issues to the forefront and evidence in a way that's not using the megaphone, but is much more nuanced. And so I think that's a great part of it too, the work that we do, in addition to poetry, whether that's through translation, through editing, through writing, prose. I think those are also to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
Well, that really segues into this next question, which is for both of you, which is, what is the role of art or the artist in the midst of a crisis? I know we talked about this a little earlier, and the sort of need to take time to reflect before trying to produce something in a crisis. But what do you think the role of art or the artist is in the midst of a crisis?
Do you want me to start, or
Sure.
Susan, do you want to start with that?
Sure, I'll start with it. The role of the artist in a crisis, I think, it depends on the crisis, I would say. I think we're in the midst of a crisis now with this global pandemic that has killed so many people and sickened so many and put so many people out of jobs, out of their homes. And my role, I think my role is primarily as a citizen in response to the crisis. As a poet, my responsibility is really to myself and to my art first, in order to create something that I feel is true and is not something I feel that I've been pressured to produce. And so if I can create something that's true and then share it with others, perhaps it will help them. That's my hope, in whatever way that reading helps us, which is a very personal way, I think. So in those two aspects, as a citizen and then as a poet. Peter.
Yeah. I'm just trying to, hold on one second. All right. I'm just fiddling with them. Okay, whatever. However, as long as you can see me. Thank you for that reflection, Susan, and to push off of it, and also, Annette, to return to the previous question. First, it depends on what genre you work in. And by that, I should say what art you work in. If you're a visual artist, your take on that's going to be one thing. If you're a musician, your take on it's going to be a little different. If you're a writer, it's going to be a little different because your medium is a little different. You do different things with your medium. It's not to say that some literary writers, poets, fiction writers, nonfiction writers, shouldn't be writing about a crisis in the present. They should if they can, because they have the tools to do it. Writers write op-eds, writers write essays, writers blog, they tweet. In this day and age, writers are able to deliver language that can be useful outside of the aesthetic universe of their craft. Again, we're talking about separating those two zones. Writers, of course, are makers of texts and are also teachers. So we're in the classroom and we have some reach into the societies we live in. But I want to return again just to the story of the group I'm a part of, Writers for Democratic Action, which began as Writers Against Trump in August of this past year. A group of us came together, extraordinary people. I don't want to leave anybody out of the steering committee, so I'm going to try to list I'm going to leave some people out. So I don't want. I mean, you can go up online and see our group. Okay. And we came together, writers in very different genres with different sensibilities, but we felt, hey, this is a crisis. Democracy is on the ropes. I mean, democracy has never been pummeled the way it was pummeled by Donald Trump. And there was a feeling that we have worked a long time in our arts. And again, we have a little bit of space that we've created in the larger civic or the larger polis. So why don't we come together and use our imaginations and our language and see what kinds of things we can do to work for democracy. In November, it was to work for the Biden-Harris election, of course. And then we got involved in the Georgia election in modest ways. And I don't mean to make any claims that we changed the world, but we simply got together and formed a community and felt some power in our own lives for being involved. So writers can get involved, and speak. And the larger your audience is, the perhaps more range your voice might have in a political time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The next question is from Armin, addressed to both of you. Have any new poems emerged for either one of you from the War in Art Soc? And I may be pronouncing that totally wrong.
No, that's correct.
That's correct. Yeah. No, not for me. Not for me.
And I have one. I have a poem that's come out of my sense of frustration and sadness and distance as a diasporan. But it's hard to write about gargantuan events. But I have something I'm working on. Short lyric poem.
Thank you. Next question is from Celeste. She says, thank you to both Susan and Peter for the richness and fertility of your work. And she's wondering if you could speak a bit about how poetry becomes a place to excavate intergenerational trauma of being descendants of Armenian genocide survivors, and also a place of hope. And let me know if you want me to repeat that.
What a beautiful question. Could you repeat it?
Absolutely. She says she's wondering if you could speak to how poetry becomes a place to excavate intergenerational trauma of being descendants of Armenian genocide survivors, and also a place of hope. So how it becomes a place to excavate the intergenerational trauma and a place of hope.
Peter, after you.
Who wants to, Susan, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll go ahead. I think that when I was a girl, my my grandfather, like Peter's grandmother, was he was the only survivor of his family in the Armenian genocide. He was from the eastern province of Mush, and he escaped at the age of 15 and told the stories of his survival to me and to my sister as we were growing up, over and over again. So these stories that I grew up hearing, I absorbed into my entire being. And wanting to be a writer, and then knowing that the writing would take the form of a poem. Writing about my grandfather was something that was necessary to me, and not only necessary, but really, I think, given my grandfather gave me his blessing in a sense. He said, you have to tell my story. So there was also this command, and it was a matter of finding the right form for it. And that took time, that took many years, but I feel that I did arrive at that in Fair Sun. And yet Peter said something earlier about these memories of his grandmother percolating up and returning. And I think that is so astute, that we don't write about something and then we're done with it and we put it away. These things remain a part of us, and we return to them again and again. So I think that perhaps the hope is there in that we are writing these stories. They don't disappear untold, and they don't get passed down only to those of us who are related by blood, but they get passed along to a much larger community. And so that act of rescuing the stories, if not the people, that's really, I think, what I referred to in my introduction my introduction of Peter, of civilization's written records. To enter these stories into the written records is what is really crucial. And I think that there's a hope in doing that.
And to add to that, coming from a place of, I agree with the way Susan has articulated that intersection between the voices of family witnesses and your own memory, and then the transformation of that memory into lyric language. But just to say something about lyric language, because poems are built out of compression, and they're built out of images and intense sensory sensations. And the poem is one of the most powerful literary forms for catching a filament of history. The poem doesn't try to capture more than that, but if it can capture a piece of a historical event, it can reverberate that event in ways that are remarkably alive and vibrant in the present. I don't mean to suggest that scholarly books aren't necessary, they are, but they take a reader into another zone of excavation. The poem excavates in ways that can be startling and vivid, layered, emotionally complex, and often this is one way to capture the traumatic that's inherited. In my case, it's inherited. The crisis is inherited through the generational story that's transmitted. But the poem has the capacity to do that. I often like to say, go read Yeats's poem 1919 and see the strange way he's decided to go after that moment of violence and civil war in Ireland. And but how the poem is able to do something that no other form could do with that moment of violence in his own nation. I feel that's part of what poems that excavate history do all the time. It's certainly an important vector in the poetry imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, you touched on this earlier. You mentioned Andy Warhol, but for both of you, and I think this is going to be a final question unless anybody else has any others. But for both of you, what visual art, music, film, what art has influenced your writing, if any? I know, Peter, you've said that it does. Susan, I'd love to hear from you as well, but if there are any other specific artists or just ways in which art has influenced your work.
Having said a few things, I'll just add quickly. In some cases, the formal nature of certain genres of visual art have informed my own sense of going someplace with the poem. I would say the gestural energy of abstract expressionism has been important to me. And the color field work is important to me. I'm a color character, and that color field doesn't just mean post-war. I mean, some of the greatest makers of color you can find in 14th and 15th century early Flemish painting. Van Eyck, Hans Holbein, Titian. Titian is not northern, but so those aspects of the dimensions of painting work in me, or I work in them in ways that I hope produce something that's interesting.
I love this question because I really am so excited by art. And as Peter said earlier, I wish I would have loved to have been a visual artist myself, a painter. There's just so much joy that I take from visual art and also from music and dance. And some of that is overt in Fair Sun, but it's much more so in Geode. So some of the artists whom I took inspiration from in Geode are Jean Ritchie, who was a pioneer of the folk movement and a great singer about environmental themes. The land artists like Walter de Maria and Robert Smithson, and also let's see, Anna Halprin, who was is a choreographer and modern dance pioneer, and the ways in which these artists incorporated the political into their art, what their relationship was to the political realm, and how they resisted it, but also incorporated it, and in some ways, resisted ideology, and in other ways tried to make it more nuanced and to speak to people in ways that where the ideas are expressed through symbolic forms or through the body or through music. I think these are all really fascinating things to think about. And yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, and thank you for those responses. We do have one last question, and I'll cut it off after this. And this question comes from Eric. I'm going to read it twice again. He says, I like thinking about that imperative, quote, you have to tell my story, quote, intention with Peter's sense that poetry captures a filament or excavates inherited crises, but perhaps only partially. So the question is, are there any facets of the inherited or discovered stories you'd both like to tell, some elements you feel you have yet to explore? So are there any facets of the inherited or discovered stories you'd like to tell, or some elements you feel that you have yet to explore?
I guess I'll just say very briefly, yes, there are many elements. I have never really written much about my grandmother, who was Armenian but was born in Iran and born in Tabriz and then lived in Tehran. And her story is much more complicated, and I would like to explore that further.
Well, I think I certainly get up every morning hoping the imagination will surprise me with something. And if that's more surprises from places I've already visited, that's great. If not, well, we keep hoping that the imagination keeps finding its way toward those new places.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that we will stop with that. So thank you again so much. Before I ask Robert to come back up to just close us out, I'm just going to send a link to the whole chat for if anybody's interested in buying books. Normally we would have a reception and a signing, and we would love for everybody to hang out together and get to chat. But in lieu of that, here is an opportunity for you to read Peter and Susan's work forever. So please check that out. And thank you again, Susan and Peter, so much. And Robert, and thank you everybody for coming. Robert, would you like to come back up and finish the...
In a word, hooray. And it was a beautifully vocal evening. And in the implied answer to all of those questions about what poetry has to do with the rest of life, both poets made it so clear that this is such a present art. When I read Emily Dickinson or Yeats, it's present in I start imagining saying it. And tonight, I was reminded of those wonderful poems of Susan's in which her grandfather speaks and the eloquence of his hard-learned, unnative English. And what we do is we use our voices to speak for the dead. And it's, Peter cites 1919. Peter is speaking for the dead Yeats too, as well as the dead grandmother. And we're, in some sense, by talking to them as well, using the voice to Yeats and to the grandparents, you're speaking to everybody. But you do it by, it's easy to embody the past when you have this organ that does it. And thank you both so much for reminding me of all of that. And I wish I could now make the customary invitation to schmooze and buy books. So all I can say is thank you, Annette, for that link in the chat. Hit that link, folks, and buy books. Thank you, poets.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.